The absolute silence that fell over the Grand Theater of Chicago that Thursday night wasn't the respectful hush preceding an ovation, but rather that suspended moment in time when 300 people simultaneously realize they've just witnessed something extraordinary. Helen Vance, a 52-year-old cleaning woman who had been cleaning the theater's corridors for 15 years, stood there, bathed in the golden spotlights, her hands still trembling beside the microphone, knowing her life had changed forever. But to understand how this ordinary woman got there, we need to go back to the beginning, 3 months earlier, when Helen was just another invisible worker in a city that never sleeps. Monday morning began like any other for Helen. At 5 a.m., the alarm clock relentlessly blared in her small 2-room apartment in Inglewood. She rose without delay, brewed a simple black coffee, and ate a slice of bread with margarine, always standing, leaning against the small kitchen windowsill overlooking a gray inner courtyard. There was no time for morning luxuries. By 6:15 a.m., she was at the bus stop, waiting for the first bus that would take her downtown. The commute to the Grand Theater took an hour and a half, time Helen spent watching the city awaken through the fogged-up bus window. She knew every corner, every traffic light, every movement of that urban routine that repeated itself day after day. It had been 15 years of making the same journey, carrying in her worn canvas bag her navy blue uniform, cleaning supplies, and the ID badge that identified her as a contract employee. At the theater, Helen was part of the scenery, an almost ghostly presence gliding through the corridors while musicians, singers, and dancers rehearsed their performances. She cleaned the dressing rooms after the shows, collected the programs left on the seats, polished the mirrors in the restrooms, and vacuumed the velvet carpets in the foyers. Her work was essential, but she knew she was invisible. The artists passed her without a greeting. The theater administrators treated her like furniture, and the security guards only nodded when she showed her badge at the employee entrance. Helen had become accustomed to this social invisibility, not out of resignation, but out of a kind of emotional protection she had developed over the years. It was easier to be ignored than humiliated, she thought, safer to go unnoticed than to draw attention to her humble origins, her sometimes incorrect English, her already graying hair, which she always wore in a simple bun. What nobody at the theater knew was that Helen possessed an extraordinary gift. Her voice, deep and velvety, had an impressive range and a unique ability to convey profound emotions. As a child in rural Texas, she sang in the church of the small town where she was born, and her voice moved the congregation to tears during hymns. Her mother, Mary, used to say that Helen had a voice like a fallen angel, an expression she never fully understood, but which she carried with her like a secret. At 18, Helen came to Chicago with the dreams of many country girls, to make it big, to sing in nightclubs, maybe even record an album. But the reality of the metropolis was cruel to her dreams. Without money for singing lessons, without contacts in the artistic world, without the formal education that would open doors, she saw her talent stifled by the need to survive. She found work as a maid, then as a saleswoman, later as a cleaning woman. Each year that passed, music became more distant, until one day she simply stopped singing. Silence settled into Helen's life like an unwanted guest who decides to stay. She no longer sang in the shower, she didn't whistle while she worked, she didn't hum the songs she heard on the radio. It was as if her voice had hidden itself somewhere deep in her soul, waiting for the right moment to resurface. That moment arrived unexpectedly, one Wednesday afternoon when Helen was cleaning the main stage of the theater after a rehearsal by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. The musicians had gone on break, leaving behind their instruments and scattered sheet music on the stands. Helen moved silently among the violins and cellos, collecting crumpled papers and cleaning the varnish of the instruments that reflected the stage lights. Then her eyes fell on a piece of sheet music left on the grand piano. The musical notes seemed to dance on the page, and Helen felt a pang in her chest, a sudden longing for something she had lost long ago. Without thinking, she approached the piano and carefully placed the sheet music in the correct position. It was Schubert's Ave Maria, one of the pieces she had known since childhood. Helen looked around. The theater was empty, silent as a cathedral. Only the stage lights were on, creating a golden circle around the piano. She touched one key, then another, testing the tuning. The sound echoed through the empty hall, pure and crystalline. And then, almost without realizing it, she began to sing. The first notes came out trembling, hesitant, as if her voice were relearning to exist. But as the music flowed, something magical happened. Helen's voice opened like a flower, blooming after a long winter, gaining strength, depth, expressiveness. She sang with her eyes closed, letting decades of repressed emotion come to the surface through the notes. Schubert's Ave Maria had never sounded so human, so full of pain and hope at the same time. Helen sang to the empty theater, but it was as if she was singing to her dead mother, to her lost dreams, to the girl she once was and who still lived hidden somewhere in her heart. When the last note faded into the air, Helen opened her eyes and saw a figure standing in the stage entrance. It was Maestro Robert Minucci, the artistic director of the Grand Theater of Chicago, who had returned to retrieve a forgotten score. His eyes were wide, and for a moment he seemed to have seen a ghost. "My God," he murmured, "who are you?" Helen felt her blood run cold. For 15 years she had been invisible in that place, and now she was being seen in the worst way, as an employee who had overstepped her boundaries. She stammered an apology, trying to explain that she was just cleaning, that she didn't intend to— "No," interrupted the maestro, approaching with cautious steps, as if he feared she would disappear if he made any sudden movements. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Helen didn't know how to answer. How could she explain that she had learned on her own, in rural Texas, singing to her father's goats and the birds of the scrubland? How could she say that her first music teacher had been her own mother, who sang while washing clothes in the creek? The maestro came closer, his eyes shining with an excitement that Helen couldn't understand. "You work here, don't you? I've seen you in the hallways." He paused, as if processing an impossible discovery. "How long have you been singing like this?" "I don't sing," Helen replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean, I don't sing anymore. It's been a long time." "Don't sing anymore?" The maestro seemed genuinely perplexed. "But what I just heard, it was extraordinary. You have a unique voice, a natural musicality that can't be taught. Why did you stop?" Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes. How could she explain that she had stopped because the world hadn't given her voice a space, that she had traded dreams for survival, that she had learned that people like her didn't have a right to golden stages and applauding audiences? "Life," was all she could say. The maestro nodded, as if he understood perfectly what she meant. "What's your name?" "Helen. Helen Vance." "Helen," he repeated, savoring the name. "I have a proposition for you. In 3 months, we'll have a special concert to celebrate the theater's centennial. We want to include a performance that represents the soul of this house, something that shows how music can arise from the most unexpected places." He paused, studying her face. "I'd like you to sing with us." Helen felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Sir, I think you don't understand. I'm a cleaner. I clean this place. I'm not an artist." "You are an artist," the maestro said with a conviction Helen had never heard directed at her. "Perhaps you're the most genuine artist who has ever stepped on this stage. The question is, are you willing to remember that?" In the days that followed, Helen lived in a state of shock. While working, she found herself observing the musicians with different eyes, paying attention to rehearsals that had previously been just background noise. At night, at home, she sat in her small kitchen and tried to sing softly, testing if her voice was still there, if what had happened hadn't been just a dream. The maestro had given her his card and asked her to think about the proposition. "You don't have to decide now," he had said, "but if you decide to accept, we'll start rehearsals next week." Helen carried the card in her purse like a talisman, taking it out from time to make sure it was real. Maestro Robert Minucci, the card said in golden letters, artistic director of the Grand Theater of Chicago. During those weeks of uncertainty, Helen began to revisit her own history.
She remembered the first time she sang in public, at 7 years old, at a town festival. She remembered the pride in her mother's eyes when she sang lullabies. She remembered the dreams she had brought to Chicago, naive perhaps, but sincere and ardent. And she also remembered the day she decided to stop singing. It had been after a disastrous audition at a nightclub in the city's South Side, when the owner had dismissed her with a cruel phrase, "Honey, you can sing all right, but you don't fit the profile we're looking for. Try a church, why don't you?" The profile he was looking for was clear: young, blonde women with sculpted bodies. Helen, in her 20s, already carried the weight of life on her face and the insecurity of someone who knew she didn't fit the mold. But now, at 52, Helen was being invited to sing on the city's most important stage, not for her looks, not for contacts or influence, but purely for her voice, for what she truly was. The decision came on a Sunday morning, while she was having coffee looking out the kitchen window. There was a mockingbird singing on the antenna of the neighboring building, and its melody was simple but beautiful. The bird wasn't singing to impress anyone. It wasn't singing to be seen or applauded. It sang because that was its nature, its reason for being. Helen picked up her phone and dialed the maestro's number. "Maestro Robert, this is Helen Vance, the cleaner. I'd like to accept your proposition." Rehearsals began the following week, and Helen discovered that fear can be simultaneously paralyzing and liberating. For the first time in decades, she was doing something that scared her deeply, but that also made her feel alive in a way she had forgotten. The maestro had chosen a repertoire that combined classical music and Brazilian popular music. "We want to show that music has no boundaries," he explained, "that a true voice can move between Puccini and Cartola with the same authenticity." Helen rehearsed every after work. She arrived at the Grand Theater still in her uniform, carrying the bag with the scores the maestro had given her. In the first few days, she felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. The other musicians in the orchestra looked at her with curiosity, some with skepticism. "Is she really a janitor?" she heard a violinist ask his colleague. "Seems so," was the reply. "The maestro discovered her cleaning the stage." Helen pretended she hadn't heard, but the words stung like thorns. She knew she was being tested, that she needed to prove she deserved to be there. But as the rehearsals progressed, something interesting happened. Her voice, freed from the captivity of decades, began to flourish with a maturity she had never possessed in her youth. The maestro worked with her patiently, helping her find the nuances of each piece, helping her understand that singing wasn't just emitting beautiful notes, but about telling stories, conveying emotions, creating invisible connections between the heart of the singer and the heart of the listener. "You have something that can't be taught," he said one afternoon, after she had finished a particularly moving rehearsal of Canto de Osaña, translated to something like Song of Osaña, or replaced with a culturally relevant song title. "You have truth in your voice. That's rarer than any technique." Helen was beginning to believe him when the incident that almost made her give up everything happened. It was a Thursday, 2 weeks before the concert. Helen had finished rehearsing and was putting away the scores when she heard familiar voices in the hallway. They were 2 elegant theater administrators she knew by sight, talking loudly without caring who might hear. "It's absurd," one of them said, "turning the centennial concert into a joke. A janitor singing? What message does that send to our sponsors?" "Exactly," the other agreed. "We already have to put up with these social programs. Now we're going to have to pretend it's art." Helen felt the world spin around her. All the insecurities she had tried to suppress came to the surface at once. She wasn't an artist. She was just a janitor wanting to be something she wasn't. She was making a fool of herself, being the subject of laughter and malicious comments. She left the theater that afternoon, determined not to return. At home, she called the maestro and said she wasn't feeling well, that maybe it would be better to find someone else for the concert. He tried to argue, but Helen was firm. "I'm not fit for this," she said, hanging up the phone. Helen spent the whole weekend at home, sheltered in the silence that had been her company for so many years. She didn't sing, she didn't listen to music, she didn't even turn on the radio. It was as if she were trying to return to her previous state, the safe invisibility she had abandoned. But on Sunday night, when she had already decided that on Monday she would tell the maestro that she was definitely out of the project, Helen received an unexpected visit. It was Mary, a 70-year-old woman who worked as a ticket seller at the theater and who had become a kind of friend in recent times. She appeared at the apartment door carrying a cornbread and a determination that Helen knew well. "Girl," said Mary, entering unceremoniously, "you're going to explain to me what's going on." Helen tried to evade her, but Mary didn't accept evasions. She had worked at the theater for 40 years, had seen artists come and go, had followed the backstage of hundreds of shows. She knew how to recognize true talent when she saw it, and she also knew how to recognize fear when she saw it. "You're scared," she said, cutting the cornbread and serving 2 pieces. "I understand, but let me tell you something." And then Mary told her own story. How she had arrived at the theater as a girl, the daughter of a poor family from rural Texas. How she had dreamed of being a ballerina, how she had given up that dream to become a ticket seller. "I spent my whole life watching other people fulfill the dreams I didn't have the courage to pursue," she said. "Don't let that happen to you." "But I heard some women talking," protested Helen. "They said I'm a joke." "So what?" Mary retorted. "Are you going to let 2 envious women decide your destiny? Girl, there are people who will never accept that someone like you, like us, has talent. That's their problem, not yours." That night, Helen didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen, looking out the window, thinking about Mary's words. She remembered her mother, who had died 5 years earlier without ever having seen her daughter sing professionally. She remembered all the dreams she had abandoned, all the times she had diminished herself to fit into the space the world offered her. And she also remembered that afternoon on stage, when her voice had filled the empty theater with a beauty that was hers, that came from within her, that no one could take away or delegitimize. On Monday morning, Helen arrived at the theater earlier than usual. She looked for the maestro and simply said, "I'm ready to rehearse." The following 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Helen rehearsed every afternoon, worked in the mornings, and spent her nights studying the scores. Mary had become her main cheerleader, attending rehearsals whenever she could and offering a friendly ear when insecurities returned. The maestro had noticed the transformation in Helen. She was no longer trying to hide behind her voice. She was assuming her presence, her personality, her story. "You're singing with your soul," he said after a particularly intense rehearsal. "That's what makes the difference between a good singer and a true artist." 3 days before the concert, Helen was called to a meeting with the theater's board. She entered the elegant room with a racing heart, sure she would be dismissed at the last minute. But to her surprise, what she found was a group of people eager to get to know her better. "Helen," the general manager said, "we want you to know how incredibly proud we are to have you with us for this concert. Your story embodies everything we believe in, that art transcends social class, that talent can emerge from anywhere." Helen left the meeting with a strange feeling. For the first time in a long time, she felt valued not in spite of who she was, but precisely because of who she was. The night of the concert arrived shrouded in an aura of anticipation Helen could almost touch. The Grand Theater of Chicago was packed, its 3,000 seats filled with an audience that included music critics, sponsors, established artists, and ordinary people who had heard about the cleaning lady who sings and had come out of curiosity. Helen arrived at the theater 2 hours before the show began. She wore a simple but elegant dress that Mary had insisted on buying for her. "You need to feel beautiful," her friend had said, "not for others, but for yourself." In her dressing room, Helen looked in the mirror and saw a woman she didn't quite recognize. She was no longer the invisible cleaning lady, but she wasn't an artificial version of herself either. She was simply Helen, with all her history, her fears, her dreams, and her talent. The maestro appeared at the dressing room door. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Helen replied, laughing nervously. "Great," he said. "That means you understand the importance of what you're doing." "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing exactly who she was thanking. Perhaps life, perhaps her mother, perhaps that maestro who had had the sensitivity to recognize her voice that distant afternoon. Helen Vance had found her voice, but more importantly, she had found her mission, to use her voice to amplify other voices, to use her light to illuminate other paths, to use her courage to inspire other people to find the courage within themselves. And so, while the city of Chicago slept outside, Helen continued singing in her small room, her voice mingling with the silence of the night, reminding everyone that true music is born not from gilded stages, but from the human heart, and that all of us, absolutely all of us, have a song waiting to be sung. The cleaning lady had become an artist, but without ever ceasing to be a cleaning lady. The invisible woman had become a mentor, but without ever forgetting what it was like to be ignored. The voice that had been silent for decades had become a symbol that it is never too late to be reborn. Helen Vance had proven that the deepest transformation is not the one that makes us cease to be who we are, but the one that allows us to be who we always were, without fear, without shame, without limits imposed by others or by ourselves. Her voice had been reborn, and with it, the hope that we can all find our own music, our own light, our own way of contributing to making this world a little more beautiful, a little more just, a little more human.